Hi, I'm Angela Fehr. The best way to use watercolor in a loose and fluid style is to paint subjects you know really well. That way you can approach your painting subject with confidence and really this innate knowledge that helps you to get to the essence of that object. The problem is we don't want to paint the same thing over and over again, so we need to be aware that as we develop our skills in new subjects, it's going to take a bit of a process to find our own loose voice in how to paint that. In the video that I'm sharing with you today, you'll be seeing me paint an orchid flower in two different styles. So basically one where I'm learning how to paint it, and the second one where I get to then create my own expression of that object and be a little bit more loose in it. I really encourage you, if you're learning to paint, if you're wanting to paint more loosely, paint the same thing repeatedly. There are links down below in the description for this video to all 4 parts of this lesson, so you don't miss any of them, and a supply list as well, and a link to the reference photo. Paint along with me. We're going to have fun painting this Bauhinia. It's a Hong Kong orchid flower in our beautiful loose style that just showcases the beauty of watercolor. I love the look of these Bauhinia. Hong Kong orchid flower is another term, and they've grown this beautiful cluster. And the challenge is when you're painting something like this is how do you paint it loosely without getting caught up in all those little details. And so we're going to give it a try. And the thing that I think a lot of artists get tied up in, I'm just cleaning in my palette as I talk here, is that we tend to think of objects that we're painting as individual single elements. So we have here a cluster of beautiful flowers, and instead of looking at the cluster, we look at the flowers, and then we break it down and we look at the individual petals. So we're looking at all these individual items that are very complicated to paint because there's so many of them. And we don't have to do that. When you're painting loosely, the trick is to instead distill your scene down into just a few single elements. So that's what we're going to try and do. And when we're looking at the flowers as a whole, I'm zooming in a little bit and cropping so that I don't have to paint, so that I fit my shape of my paper as well. And there's a couple things I want to notice, and one is the white in this, the highlights of the bright sunlight that create areas of my painting that are absolutely basically a pure white. So I want to make sure that I'm not painting on those areas. And then the rest of the painting, I want to look at the items as a whole. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to paint basically the second lightest thing in my painting, which is my flowers, the parts that aren't lit by sun. So I've mixed up a little bit of 2 of Daniel Smith's new colors, the Rose Madder Permanent with their lavender. And these are new pigments from Daniel Smith, and they're beautiful, and they make a really nice kind of muted tone for my painting. So I'm just kind of looking at the outside shapes right now, and you can see how juicy my wash is. It's very shiny and moist, and that gives me a long drying time. And I want a long drying time because that will enable me to paint all my flowers instead of just a few, instead of painting them one at a time. And I'm going to try to, actually I'm going to paint those right away as well. Over here is where I have the first shaft of bright sunlight, so I'm going to paint around that. But I'm looking at the outer shapes, and I'm looking at the light areas inside those outer shapes right now. And again, keeping with that very rich, or keeping with that very loose, moist wash. And inside this area over here, we've got this quite a mass of flowers that are in that lovely violet tone. And if you don't have these new colors from Daniel Smith, feel free to use what you have. I never insist that everybody use exact same colors as me, because color changes all the time. The colors we see change based on the lighting of the room. Color mixing is very versatile. You can really, all you need to do this is a pinky red and a blue to give you kind of that violet tone, and then you're all set. So I've just painted one large shape that's going to be my flowers. I've left a couple white spaces for those highlights. And now before I go further and continue on the right side of my painting, I'm going to give myself a visual cue. And this is what I do when I'm painting loosely and don't want to draw anything in my painting, is I will notice areas where I might make a mistake, like my stems here that are this pale green and white. It would be very easy to paint over those. So I am going to make sure I don't do that by putting them in right now. And a little bit of that green is flowing into my flower. That is okay. Light reflects. And if you're thinking about light as being reflective, that means that a shadow is going to have, there's going to be cast light. When the sun hits the greens, it's going to cast a green shadow on the flowers. When the sun hits the flowers, it's going to cast a shadow on the greens. Everything's connected. And that's why we don't have to paint items as separate items. We get to see them as all being connected, and we can simplify just by doing that. Okay, over here, things are still starting to dry a little bit. It's starting to lose that shininess, so I want to continue my painting before it gets so dry that I see a line where my painted areas connect. So again, there's some highlights over here. There's also some really beautiful little lines where the stamens, the multiple stamens come out, and I'll do those in a minute. I don't have to paint them yet. One thing I'm really liking about these new shades from Daniel Smith is the lavender, which I'm using. I had a little bit more lavender in my mix over here than I do up here. And the lavender is made of ultramarine blue and ultramarine violet and a little bit of white. And so those pigments combined, the ultramarines tend to granulate, so I get a really beautiful texture over there that I think is quite pretty. And this one flower in this area has a lot of reflected light, a lot of highlight on it, so I want to leave that for sure to get that strong sense of sunlight. And don't want to lose that white. With watercolor, if you lose your white, if you paint over it, it's very hard to get that glow back. And so if you're wanting a beautiful painting full of light, you need to leave those white spaces and not paint over them. And if you can capture that, then you'll have just your most glowing and vibrant results. So I've basically gotten the main shapes down right now. I don't want to stop painting yet. I want to continue, and I want to first get those some of those beautiful stamens in. And I'm going with a white background for this painting. If I were painting a colored background, I would probably start by just doing a very pale wash of color over the entire page. A little very pale green in the areas where the leaves are, and a very pale pink, pinky violet in the areas where my flowers are. But I don't have to do that for this because I think I really would like a white background for this. If I don't go with the white background, if I decide to paint a colored background after I've painted my flowers, which it's never too late to change your mind, but it does make it a little more difficult because I will have to paint around these delicate stamens that I'm painting right now. And I almost never use masking fluid, but I would probably consider it in this case, just to keep those delicate colors, or those delicate lines. It's just so easy to paint over them. Okay, so doesn't that just look like flowers? And I've only painted one layer and I have no details. And that's one thing I love about loose painting and painting without sketching, is when you do it successfully, you get a real confidence looking at how everything's kind of working. We're not stopping yet though. While everything is still moist, I want to start touching in some color. There's a beautiful peachiness to the upper petals. We want to get that in. And I'm going to go with a bit of a smaller brush because I want a delicate touch. up until, and I'm going to use, I think, this Mayan red. It's just a little bit of a more coral red. And so I think it'll be a really nice peachy tone up in here. You know what, it needs to be a little more yellow. So I'm going to add a little bit of Orchid. If it's too pink, it just blends in too much. So I'm going to touch it in a little bit over here. The Orchid is kind of muddier than I like. Let's go with lemon yellow. And as I mix on the side, right now the color I have is just too vibrant. Be aware when you're mixing color that, you know, it doesn't always work the first time. If you get a muddy color, then that means you might need to switch up, choose a color with a little less complementary color to the other color that you're mixing it with. A little bit of those peachy tones in some of these petals. And I'm keeping this loose. I'm not going to be painting every individual flower here. I'm going to want that feeling of a cluster of flowers without painting every detail. Some of that will need to happen after these flowers dry, but some of it we can continue to work on right now. I'm going to throw in some of my darks right now, and going back to that original petal color that I mixed, my Rose Madder Permanent, and my lavender. And I'm going to go a little more on the lavender, and I think I'm going to add a little ultramarine to it too. We know that's one of the colors that makes up that lavender. So by adding that to our Rose Madder Permanent lavender mixture, we're going to get a deeper violet, which I think will make for a good shadow for us. And things are really starting to dry on my paper, so I'm really going to have to work quickly to not get to the point of no return. And I call it that because there's a certain stage in your painting when adding fresh pigment is going to ruin your painting or create blooms. And if you want blooms, it's not going to ruin anything. But if you don't want blooms, you're going to be in trouble. Because when we introduce fresh water into a nearly dry wash, that fresh water will push against the pigment that's trying to set in place. It's going to push against it and create an edge. And that's what we call a bloom. And we're getting a little bit of a bloom right here. You can see it's a little bit crisper than it needs to be. Because I'm paying attention, I see it, and I'm going to just very carefully lift some of that moisture with my thirsty brush. And as I'm lifting that moisture, I'm also softening that edge, so it just faded away. If I were to wait until everything had dried, it would be a lot harder to remove that edge. Okay, while we're waiting for this area to dry, and actually there's one more thing I see, and that is over here, I think I want that feeling of sunlight as well. And I need a connection between the elements in order for that to work. So I'm gonna get a bloom. So we're going to have to do some quick bloom prevention here in just a second. But I want to get that, just like we have this bright spot here, I want a bright spot up there too. Okay, so we're going to have to pause, and I'm going to sit and watch. And I can see the water coming in here and starting to make an edge here, starting to make an edge here. So that's where I'm going to wait, because it's too soon for me to fix it, I think. If I start to lift color here, I'm going to remove paint as well. Sometimes you just need to wait and let things continue to go wrong until it's the right time to make them right. And as this water starts to dry, I'll have that moment where I can soften the edge like I did over here. So we're going to let that pause, and then we'll come back to it in just a minute.